How is everybody today? Good. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm so excited about today's program, not just because we have one of America's outstanding generals, but largely because of the issues and themes that General Zinni will be talking about. Of course, you know Anthony Zinni. He's a retired four-star general in the U.S. Marine Corps, former commander-in-chief of U.S. Central Command, a topic close to our work here in our Middle East Task Force. General Zinni was former special envoy for the United States to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and he's current chairman of the board of BA Systems. He is the author of the new book called Leading the Charge: Leadership Lessons from the Battlefield to the Boardroom. We've arranged it today so that you can all get your own copy, hopefully inscribed by the general. And I listened a few weeks ago to General Zinni on the Diane Rehm show, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of being on her show on occasion, so I tend to turn it on and see what she's got cooking. And I think that the exchange that General Zinni and Diane Rehm had that day was one of the most extraordinary exchanges about a very fair-minded critique of some of the decisions that led into the Iraq War, but also an interesting candor about Afghanistan and what still needed to be done. And I think it's rare to find someone who, frankly, avoids easy ideological dispositions and doesn't put every encounter engagement in the same box. And I think we're going to have a fascinating and important exchange today on some of these issues. When I titled this program, we were just meeting for the last few minutes and having a discussion. I called it Sorting Out America's Honor Problem. And I was inspired by that by listening to General Zinni's comments on the Diane Rehm show, and I was afraid of what he would think about it. But he told me he sort of liked the title. He didn't pick it. But I do think that sorting out America's problem with regard to what happened in the lead up to the Iraq War, what were the institutional players, and how we moved into essentially, in my view, as folks know, a set of decisions that had incredible consequence on the country, but were not debated enough. You can't, as a great country, assure that you're not going to make bad decisions, but you can make, as part of that process, the most informed decision-making structure and call participants together in a way to try to make those best decisions. I tend to be one who worries about a repeat of that with Afghanistan. I think General Zinni may disagree with my assessment, but nonetheless, to have a full-fledged, honest, credible discussion with the right people in the room so that all voices are heard is something that I heard loud and clear from General Zinni's comments with Diane Rehm. I will encourage everyone to turn off your cell phones, and we'll go from there. I also want to welcome the viewers that are watching live on the Washington Note and the American Strategist website. And without further ado, please welcome General Tony Zinni.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it was an interesting title. At first, I thought maybe we ought to change honor to credibility, which is reestablishing U.S. credibility, which probably has to come first in some ways. I was talking to a friend of mine recently that's very familiar with the Middle East, and it served out there, and I actually quote him in the book. And we were talking about reactions we were getting in our frequent visits out to our old haunts from the leadership in the Gulf, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said everywhere he was going, he was hearing this comment that there was deep concern that the United States couldn't, and the term was, manage things anymore. Whether what we did was right or wrong in their views or in their view, but we just couldn't get it done. We just seemed to be, in recent years, maybe going back to Vietnam, and I'm not sure, but we just don't seem to be able to finish the job, get it done, manage our interests well, even if we see them differently than others. And what struck me about that is I was hearing exactly the same thing. I mentioned in the book, it wasn't a form of gloating or criticism. It was actually sincere concern that you're supposed to be able to manage things well. You're supposed to be able to get them done. We're supposed to be able to trust you. And when you can't get it right, what does that mean for all of us? And that kind of conversation was going on too often. I also had another conversation with a friend about everything that transpired since 9/11. And we were sort of debating back and forth the right and wrong of the decisions that were made. And I asked him if he were in a position where, let's say, a few days after 9/11, he went into a coma. And he knew about 9/11. He knew who did it. Now he came out of that coma 8 years later and asked what happened. You know, Al-Qaeda, we know, blew up Washington, the Pentagon, and the Twin Towers. And he said, so what did we do about it? Well, let me tell you where we are today. We're in Iraq. What? No, we're in Iraq. We've probably spent $1 trillion. We've lost over 4,300 troops and significantly more in terms of serious injury beyond that. Lost a lot of credibility. Why were we in Iraq? How did that happen? Are we still there? Of course we're still there. We're rebuilding. We've invested in it. There's still over 100,000 troops. There's a plan to ease our way out, but we'll still stay committed to it. And the confusion has to be, well, how did that come into play with Al-Qaeda, who was in Afghanistan? Well, we're in Afghanistan. We're in Afghanistan. We have spent hundreds of billions of dollars probably to this point. We have a troop commitment that's rising there. We're rebuilding Afghanistan, and we're fighting the Taliban there. We're fighting the Taliban. What about Al-Qaeda? Well, they're in Pakistan. And we're helping Pakistan stabilize it, rebuild it. We're investing, providing billions of dollars to support their military, a shaky government, and we're still involved there. Oh, we're going after Al-Qaeda. No, we're going after the Taliban, and we're helping them fight the Taliban. Well, you get where I'm going with this. This would be very confusing when you sort of take an objective look back, look at the amount of treasure, the lives of our soldiers, the damage to our reputation, our international stature, our ability to manage things. It's confusing as to how we got there. And how do we restore this credibility? I'm certainly not here to rehash what we've gone through. I mean, I've said enough about it, and so has everybody else. But what happens going forward? We have a new administration that has promised to change things. And the initial expectations, obviously, are very high. The initial speeches from the bully pulpit have been well received, but they are words. And now others are waiting for the actions. So what needs to happen? And I want to just share some thoughts of what I think needs to happen. First of all, there's a law in the United States, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, that requires every administration to put out its national security strategy 150 days in office. No administration ever pays attention to it. It always kind of surprises me. But the national security strategy at given times, I think, is very important. And although maybe at times of peace and when there isn't anything going on that's tremendously threatening or confusing, the strategy gets little attention. But there are times when it takes on added importance. If you remember the Bush national security strategy, which came after 9/11, there was a very small piece in that talked about preemption. But that became the theme. That became the Bush doctrine. And so I think it's very important now to follow up the initial speeches with a strategic statement. And there has to, and Steve and I were talking about this, we were trying to debate what the theme might be. How would it capture, where preemption, or if you go back to the Clinton administration, it was engagement. And that term engagement took on a life of its own. It became so popular it wasn't allowed to be spoken in the following administration ever again. It says something about what it meant. And I know from my time at CENTCOM, that got translated down to us in the Quadrennial Defense Review by Secretary Cohen to, under that engagement strategy or strategic tenet, to go and shape your area of responsibility. And we were not given any bounds on what that meant, on that shaping. Denny Blair at the time, our current DNI, was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, and he saw that as shaping what he called security communities, building sort of regional capabilities, ability to handle your own problems with our support, not just military problems. Dana Priest, was on to us. We were getting outside our box. We were well beyond the military and what we were doing until we got caught. But what we were trying to do is then help pull together the other elements of power to help shape these environments in a positive way. And our attempt, because it was in our interest, was to be preventative. Where we saw things now beginning to go wobbly or destabilizing a bit, what could we do to shore it up, to help build capacity, build the right institutions to prevent destabilization? There wasn't much of an interest in that. There wasn't much of an appetite for that. I mean, in the good old days of the Helms era, anything that looked like foreign aid wasn't very popular. And yet we could see that the alternative to let things become destabilized and deal with them was far more expensive. So I think what we're hearing now is sort of a return to that, but maybe even more forceful than before. Not just engagement for engagement's sake, but actually doing something in terms of resources and structure in this sort of smart power environment now, to actually do something physically in terms of our organization structure and resources to balance out, you know, that hard power, soft power into that smart power formula that's so popular now and being discussed. And that makes sense. That's the action that needs to take place. So the strategy starts this. It will set the tone. It would be the follow-up to the initial speeches and communication. And it will be the authority then for our own government structure and what that means all the way down, because from the strategy cascades the actions in the organization and the allocation of resources to make that happen. And you have then a justification for that when you go back to the strategy. So I think that's a first step, a well-thought-out national security strategy that captures what this administration wants to do, that changes the tone now, not just in a speech and in an outreach to a community, but it changes the tone in terms of directing the government and everybody into what it has to do. And then I think what becomes important is what follows from that strategy. Now, I've been a big supporter, and I've probably been involved in every study in this town on smart power and what it means. How do you build the capacity in the non-military pieces to make it come up to what Secretary Gates said is the kind of equivalent partnership that we need out there that we're trying to build this? And I have to admit, I'm very frustrated in this because I don't see any very serious thinking about this or commitment to it. Because it's not a matter of throwing money and people at a problem. Increasing the size of the State Department, increasing the budget of USAID, those things aren't going to get it alone. It has to be a major restructuring and reorganization. We can look at recent events, take Iraq, the CPA, the PRTs that have been out in the field, and look at the disasters they've been in many ways, not because there weren't well-intentioned, caring people, but they were not properly structured. They didn't have a culture of planning. They weren't organized in the right way to take on these missions. When I was at CENTCOM, I used to look at my 11 war plans that I had. If you were to go to my counterpart in Europe or the Pacific or Korea, you would see the same thing. When you looked at our war plans, you saw a vibrant, alive set of plans that were rehearsed, practiced, modified, reviewed, in every aspect that we can to make sure they were dynamic enough and looked at current conditions, all dealing with the military piece of the problem. When I looked at my war plan for Iraq, I knew in 3 weeks I could go to Baghdad, I could defeat the Republican Guard, and I could take down the regime. The question was, and then what? Because I couldn't answer the and then what question. It caused me, when I was there, to have a separate, on Secretary Cohen's authority, a separate war game, if you will, that we did up here in Washington with Booz Allen to say, what do I face after I accomplish that mission, which I'm tasked to do? Well, it scared the hell out of me. When I listened to our intelligence community, I listened to our State Department and others that had exceptional knowledge in there, and my own people that obviously had spent a lot of time in this region, understood Iraq, and understood the threats that can come from outside into Iraq, the problems that could emerge from inside with the very fragmented and fragile society that was described. And I thought, my God, there is no plan for all this. If you were to go to Korea right now, I guarantee you our commander in Korea has a great plan for what he has to do should, hostilities break out with the Koreans. But once he reaches Pyongyang, what happens then? And then what? Do you think there is a plan for restructuring a society, for rebuilding it? Now, it takes less dramatic events around the world, where we have societies on the edge, where their destabilization are going to affect not only our interests, but maybe international interests. Are there plans for stabilizing these kinds of societies? No, because the military plans the military piece, but no one else plans the other pieces. What happens on the political, the economic, the social reconstruction? Where are the plans for that? How are they maintained? If I produce a war plan, when I'm tasked from the Joint Staff to do it, they review it every other year. I exercise it every year. The service chiefs look at the capabilities they're required to provide. There is a plan called the Joint Capabilities Plan that allocates forces for me for that. They have to train and be ready to execute that plan. We build a whole set of timelines as to how we would deploy the forces into theater to do it. We exercise our options once we kick off as to how we might handle it. When I look back at my Iraq war plan when I was there, it required 380 to 400,000 troops. I had to seal the borders, control the population as we pushed back the regime. We had to ensure that the infrastructure was protected. We had to try to retain the regular army in being, to ensure it didn't disintegrate because we wanted to rebuild them after vetting their leadership. All these pieces went into that. Now, I didn't know where the economic, political, and social piece may come in the reconstruction, the capacity building in those areas. So that part's woefully inadequate. And it's not only inadequate in a post-conflict environment, it's inadequate in the upfront piece. If you go around the world today and you look at what our military does in the way of security assistance, it's huge. If you came into my old area at CENTCOM and you went to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, or you went to Egypt, or you went to Iraq now, you see these huge structures that we have that provide for the training, equipping, organizing, education of the security forces. As we pull out of Iraq right now, there's a huge security assistance program that will remain in place. The acronym is MNSTICI. Don't ask me to, I was there for a long time, but I couldn't understand what MNSTICI meant. And it's going to stay. And it has a plan. It has a plan that goes out to 2020 on the rehabilitation and construction of the Iraqi security forces. Is there a MNSTICI for the government? Is there a MNSTICI for the economy? Is there a MNSTICI for the social issues and the tribal and ethnic and religious issues that are still on the ground? No. There's no counterpart to that anywhere. And if you went out and looked at military-to-military relationships in the regions now, you would see that they're very strong. In many cases, they're the thin thread of a relationship that we hold on to. In my case, back in the mid and late 90s, our relationship with Pakistan was based on the thin thread of a military-to-military relationship, even though it was sanctioned in so many ways. And so if we're going to go to this smart power, it's not a matter of going to Congress and getting some more money and people for organizations. It's going to have to be a major restructuring and cultural change. Now, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, being involved in study groups, and this is the conclusion I came to. Everybody's afraid to think big, and it's going to take big thinking to change this. No one wants to take on a restructuring of the government a la 1947 National Security Act, and that's what it would take. No one wants to change their culture. No one wants to suddenly become planners and get deeply involved. Everybody wants to just sort of salute this with Band-Aids. Create a little office in State Department, stabilization and reconstruction. Create a little joint a task force or agency and send a few people down from the agencies to the CENTCOMs of the world and do a little planning on the side with them. That's not going to get it. And so the restructuring and the willingness to restructure on a major level our government to flatten, streamline it, make it more responsive, have a deployable capability, be able to structure programs and plan, to do something dramatic. And I've tried these suggestions, for example. Take the regional bureaus out of State Department, yank them out, and put them and co-locate them with the combatant commanders from the regions. You still report back to State Department, just like the CENTCOM reports to the Pentagon, but co-locate them. And have other organizations from other agencies that marry up with them. Why is a regional bureau in Washington? We don't put the military regional commands in Washington. Do something simple like have the same geography. We don't have the same geography. And no one really cares much about that. It makes a big difference if my counterpart in State Department has Israel in or Israel out. And that was the case when I was there. I overlapped 4 different bureaus in State Department when I was at CENTCOM. And geography matters. Who's in and who's out forms policy and shapes the way you look at your region. And so we're inconsistent there. I was telling Steve that I finally come to the conclusion you can't do it. And so here's my solution to the problem. I decided we always stick the military with it. The military always comes back and says, like Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, and from back in my time, this is not a military mission. You need to help and build the capability. Give me the partners on the battlefield. And it's yes, yes, we understand. And then the military gets stuck with the next one. I'm going to recommend we just give it to the military. And I'm going to recommend we take civil affairs, pull it out of Special Operations Command, create a separate unified command. And this command in civil affairs will put it on steroids. We'll make sure it is able to administer, provide the logistics, help do the planning, structure the processes. And if the other agencies want to play, they can plug in. But when we go to the next area where we need to prevent destabilization or we need to react after instability as hit, in the case of conflict, then on the field will be something I can trust. A civil affairs command that understands political, economic, social requirements that have to be done there, the reconstruction necessary or the construction in some cases. And it can have the advice, it can have the pieces that come together. The other agencies don't have to worry about how do you deploy, how do you get there, how the logistics and security are going to be provided, and how do you do planning. It would all be within that command. And it doesn't mean the DOD takes charge necessarily of all that. You can still influence it through your components into the organization, just like we have Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Special Operations components in our unified commands. So I would legitimize it. Give it to the poor guys that are going and girls that are going to get stuck with it anyway, and legitimize what they do. We have foreign area officers, we have advisors. Now we'll have anthropologists and economists and other things in there, and they can wear mufti, but make it part of the structure, because I think that's the only real way you're going to address it. The rest are Band-Aids and won't work. And I think it would show now a commitment that we are actually going to try to build programs to engage more in a non-military way, but not lose the benefits of the military engagement, which assures security. Do it through our unified commands and our regional bureaus, but with a command also that has emphasis and able to pull together the non-military components to be able to do that. And I think it would show a significant difference in how we are going to approach things in the regions of the world where we have these sorts of problems. And it also will help us to understand better how to allocate resources to this and convince others that you need to support it. Because I don't think we're going to get the kind of integration and the kind of structure and the kind of changes in culture, by trying to go around and fix organizations that are so very different and really incapable of that change, in my view. So that's my big, to get my attention getter, I guess, for today, and how we might do that. I do think we have to decide how we're going to show in action what we mean by the rhetoric so far. The communication has been great, but Mike Mullen, a good friend of mine, I think just this week said it's not a problem of strategic communication, it's a problem of strategic action. We've always blamed strategic communication. The world doesn't understand us because we don't communicate well. The world doesn't understand us because they don't understand what the hell we're doing. It has nothing to do with communication, has been my experience out there. So, the doing is more important than the communicating. If the doing is right, the communicating will be easy. And so we put too much emphasis on how we're going to, put lipstick on this pig and make it look good. But, in fact, you can't. It's still a pig in the end, and we have to understand how to do better. And I think that this would be the right administration that wants to change it. I think this administration has gotten off to a good start. I think it certainly has said the right things. I think certainly the expectations are high, but now's the time to deliver. The mood is right out there. I would like to say, since Steve brought it up, just to talk a little bit about Afghanistan and whether Afghanistan is important or not. This is what has concerned me for a number of years. Those that don't have our best interests at heart keep talking about our will. And whether it's right or wrong in these events, they sort of catalog, starting with Vietnam, Beirut, Somalia, the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the coal bombing, and the places where we've gotten our nose bloody, that once we've gotten it bloody, we've lost our determination, our will to hang in there. And so what they say to those that would support us, that would stand by us, don't count on them. They won't be there. And so it's the plea from Ray Odierno that I heard when I was in Iraq, we have to leave with honor. You know, we have to leave, but we have to leave with honor, was important to me. And it meant that, you know, the role of the combat troops may be done, and it is done, and it should be done, and they need to come out. But what are our obligations to Iraq now? Or is that going to be added to the list? Afghanistan, the same case. You know, we've made a commitment to Afghanistan now. We got distracted after 8 years, but what are we going to leave there? Now, this is going to be a great argument. I just finished a 3-week book tour around the United States. I came back with one thing that stuck in my mind: the number of people who are opposed to our involvement in Afghanistan across the country is growing at a rate that shocked me. And it says that there's not enough, I think, explanation of the reason why, maybe an assumption on the part of the administration, which would be a big mistake. I think the bully pulpit has to be used to make sure that people understand why and how and what the expectations are, or we're going to lose them. I'm back from the United Kingdom not too long ago, and it's hanging by a thread there, as it is in Canada and elsewhere. And I think in terms of Afghanistan, there are certain pieces that have to come together. One is the internationalization of this problem. It wasn't just New York and Washington that were attacked, as we all know. And NATO evoked the attack on one is attack on all article to the Charter. But where have they been? Outside of the Brits and the Canadians, maybe the Dutch and now the French, you know, a coalition of 20-some people and nations joined together in a defensive strategic alliance. Where have they been on the battlefield? And I think it ought to be a defining moment for NATO. And we ought to make it such. If we give them a pass on this and they won't show up and do some of the heavy lifting, I think we need to reconsider NATO and what it means. I think, secondly, we have to look at the burden sharing in terms of the cost and who bears that. It shouldn't be just us alone. Again, this threat is not a threat just to the United States. We can accept that Iraq was our choice, but not here. The third thing I think that has to happen is you have to regionalize this conflict, and we need to be the glue that pulls Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and others in the region together in some sort of cooperative, coordinated effort. They look to us for that. I haven't seen it. Beside one meeting in Washington, I haven't seen that kind of coordination was necessary. We can't even get a common border security system between the two countries. You know, and we have an enemy that knows how to play the Indians off against the Pakistanis, the Afghans off against the Pakistanis, and vice versa. You know, so where is our special envoy out there making all this happen and pulling it together and making sure there's some sort of regional program? The other thing that has to happen, obviously, is we've wasted 8 years in building local capability to deal with this, security forces that are viable. We just launched thousands of Marines in the Helmand province, and 300 Afghan security forces go with them. That's just a little light, in my view, after 8 years. And so what's happened? How long is that going to take? What's the investment going to have to be? This needs to be explained and planned in some detail. We're kidding ourselves if we think there's enough troops on the ground now. I would probably guess, and I don't know, that General McChrystal's explaining that back here now. And you have to be careful that we don't underman this problem, because that will create all sorts of problems. My son's a Marine officer. He's been to Iraq and Afghanistan. He's gone back. I'd like to make sure if he's gone back, we're going to, you know, we understand that he's going to get what he needs. We're not going to let some political decision interfere with what is needed on the ground. You know, when we understand how and what General McChrystal needs. I think the other thing we need to think seriously about: will we engage the Taliban? Will we talk to them? They have made now gestures that they're willing to talk. Those things are always painful in the beginning. Are there reconcilable Taliban and others that can be reconciled? Are there others that need to be engaged? What are the conditions for that? Should it happen? When should it happen? Who should do it? If we refuse to do it, you can bet that at the local level that dialogue is going to be going on. And we have seen deals cut at the local level come back to bite us in the end. We saw that with the Pakistanis and SWAT and in the tribal areas. And you can bet it happened again in Afghanistan. And so there better be some common understanding about dialogue if it's going to be engaged, who with, what conditions, and how it's going to be structured and in what way. And basically what I see now, although there's a lot of talk about it and there have been gestures from the other side about engaging, I haven't seen any decisions made. And so these may be opportunities lost in some cases. So I think in terms of Afghanistan, we have to worry about two countries with nuclear weapons. We have to worry about destabilization of a region that's very important to the security of us and the world. We have to worry about the ability of al-Qaeda to come out from under the pressure they're under now and what they might do when they come out from that pressure, and what they might attack. We're going to see repeats of Dar es-Salaam and Nairobi and the coal bombing, and then maybe more if they're given breathing room and they come out from under it. We have to think about what it means to turn the Taliban back loose on their own societies and what that expanded form of horrific extremism may mean, for the region and beyond. If we were appalled by what we saw and the way they treated women and the way they treated their own populations, are we willing to stand by and let that happen? So if you're looking for a set of reasons, I think they're clearly there. You can argue the strategy, but if we're going to turn around and walk away from that, I think we'll have added to that list I mentioned before of where America couldn't handle it, couldn't take the punch in the nose, and couldn't manage it, and we're going to walk away from the worst of all those, with I think the implications going far beyond just us retreating to our own borders and living happily ever after. So I think it is time to go beyond the words. I think it is time to think through how we make that statement through the national security strategy and that commitment in that direction, how we seriously think about how we restructure ourselves to do business in the 21st century and not back in the 19th or 20th century. And I think it's time we make some serious decisions about what's important for us and how we provide leadership in the world and how we have an honest conversation with our allies about how we structure our common and mutual security interests going forward. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you very much, General Zinni. That was an outstanding framing, I think, of some of the challenges, particularly when you think about the national security decision-making process. But let me just take it one step higher before I open to the floor and ask a question about that. If you were to think about the Afghan challenge, which I think you framed well, there's another challenge. There's sort of two jokes I tell. One is when I was last in China, and it's actually a true story. I asked the Director of Policy Planning in Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs what they're working on, and they said, we're working on ways to keep you Americans distracted in small Middle Eastern countries. In terms of, the essential, the distraction of Iraq, or now you can replace that with the distraction of Afghanistan, creates a drawdown of resources. The other side of this is, a fundamental question of America's mystique in the world. And one of my big criticisms of the Bush administration in Iraq is that when you went to India, you went to Indonesia, you went to Malaysia, anywhere else in the world, you'd meet people and ask them what they thought of us, and they said, well, you guys have no limits. You walk through the world boldly doing whatever you want to do. We think about our limits all the time. And what I think the Bush administration managed to do with Iraq was to demonstrate very clearly military limits, which we've now followed with economic limits, I would even argue moral limits, and now the world doubts our ability to achieve what we set out to achieve. And I would ask you, with what you just suggested we do in Afghanistan, how do you maintain an image that the United States matters and has leverage globally with so much? I mean, how do you handle, as a military commander, challenges, say, perhaps in Taiwan or South Asia, or the unexpected thing you don't expect coming because you've devoted so many resources to this, what you see as this credibility commitment in Afghanistan that we and they have built up? How do you deal with that? Because it's an order of observation higher to some degree than you laid out with Afghanistan, which is the larger issue of how do you make America credible anywhere else in the world if we were to follow a plan like you just suggested?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would do is think about where we are in the world and why we're there. Let's just take the military. Why are we still in Germany, South Korea, and Japan? We intend to take our troops off of Okinawa because obviously they've outlived their welcome there. And you know where we intend to put them? Guam. Now help me here. Guam, anything that would move those troops to the scene of the crime is located on the West Coast, meaning ships and airplanes. Guam? I mean, what are we defending in Guam? I mean, I love the Guamanians. There's no military infrastructure. There's no training facilities. It's going to cost the taxpayer a fortune to build those things, which we don't have in reduced budgets. And actually, we do deployments. Our deployments to Okinawa, for example, come from our units in Hawaii. So we're going to tell a young Marine, you're going to leave your family in Hawaii, and you're going to deploy to Guam. Now, I want to explain that to my wife, that I have to go to Guam for 7 months on a deployment and leave Hawaii because I'm protecting the United States better from Guam, where I have no strategic lift, no ships, no airplanes, to move me anywhere. And
so
going from Hawaii
to
Guam. I would pull back to the forces in Japan. I'd pull back to the United States, where you have training areas, where where you have the resources you're going to use to move. But what I'm saying, the point I'm trying to make is,
can somebody call Yukio Hatoyama? And
yeah,
I think that's an important point, actually.
But it's not, but what about Germany? What about the South Korea? If I look at South Korea's population and North Korea's population, I believe South Korea ought to be under our nuclear umbrella. I believe we ought to have logistics prepositioned in South Korea should the balloon go up. I believe, obviously, that it's worth having air bases there that we use and deploy in and out of. But please tell me why we have to have ground troops in South Korea. I've seen the South Korean soldiers. I've been with the soldiers and Marines. I've commanded them. They are superb. They are excellent. When you measure one of them against their North Korean counterpart, it's like this versus this. And so why? So what I'm saying is, before we say we're overstretched and we're strapped, have we really stepped back and looked at the post-World War II structure we have out there and reevaluated it in light of the 21st century? Have we looked at where our resources go, and have we looked at the pressures we're putting on ourselves before we say we can't do something because we've overstressed ourselves when we still have these outdated commitments?
Interesting. Thank you. Let me open the floor. Dan Dombe of Financial Times. I don't know all your names, so those I just point to, you tell us who you are.
General Zinni, thank you very much for doing this. I just really wanted to ask you, following on what you said earlier, we've obviously had big strategic announcements from the Obama administration. We've had, like on Iraq and Afghanistan earlier this year, we've had big speeches, like the speech on Muslim world. Can you think of one particular topic where there's been a strategic decision, a big momentous strategic decision, a big momentous strategic break with the past? I mean, on Iran and Afghanistan, on Iran and Iraq in particular, there are very strong elements of continuity with the Bush administration's later years, it seems. Where would you suggest, has there been any big strategic decision or break so far?
I don't think so far there has, but I want to go back to my point that before you make a strategic decision, show me your national security strategy so I understand the context of the decision. If you're going to sort of now start laying out decisions without context, and rarely do I defend our Congress, but if I were a congressman, you're asking me to provide resources against this. Give me context. Show me how this fits. Justify the spending that exists. Going back to the point I just made, and show me what we're building to. How this decision fits to the accomplishment of an overall strategy or set of strategic goals in some way. There have been some minor decisions, which I wouldn't say are necessarily strategic, that have come out of the Pentagon. The cancellation of the F-22 program, the cancellation of the FCS program. Now, obviously we can say there's budgetary reasons, but here the Pentagon, Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, and the service chiefs are making some hard decisions, some strategic choices that have risk implications in them. You could argue, how much of a better airplane do you need? You got, let's say, X amount of advantage on potential adversaries. You had maybe X plus 10, but you're willing to go to maybe X minus 5. That's all strategic risk at some level when you make those decisions. Not on the level, I think, of what you're getting at. But at least there's some elements that are making these kinds of decisions. The decisions to increase manpower in the ground forces and some other things. So in a component part of our government, and I'm not here to defend the military or the Pentagon, but in my current life, we pay a painful price when these programs get canceled, but we support them. And our job in the industry ought to be to support the strategic decisions, not to fight them politically, not to go against them in any way, but to support them. So if they're making hard strategic decisions, they're owed a strategy. And they're owed some sort of strategic context when they make these things. They've taken the lead, in my mind. And I think that says something about at least the hard choices that are being made in the Pentagon and in one element.
General, before I go to the next, has the administration responded to your critique about the national strategy report? Dennis Blair and Jim Jones were both leading parts of Jim Locker's program on national security, project on national security reform, and so this was a very big issue for them. And I hadn't thought about it actually, that there's been no national strategy document released. Have they responded to you, or have you talked to Jones or Blair about that?
I haven't talked to either one of them about it. I can tell you from my days at CENTCOM, naively, I followed my instructions that my strategy ought to be built, from the natural cascading of the national security strategy to the national military strategy. Now there's two, defense and military, and it cascaded down the line. And I used to get all those documents, read them before I constructed my own. And amazingly, sometimes you find, I know this was surprising, contradictions in some of them. But the same thing was supposed to be happening in State Department, too, all the way down to the country plans. There's supposed to be this cascading. But, it bothers me when you see decisions being made now, strategic decisions, a couple that I mentioned, without even a framework for it to begin with. And it's hard to put together, and it can be controversial. You have to avoid making it just a statement of values. I've seen national security strategy become a statement of principles of values that everybody's saluting, and it says nothing, doesn't make hard priorities, doesn't list hard priorities, make hard choices, and make hard statements that are necessary in some of that so it can guide those kinds of decisions on down. But I think if we mean it this time, that would be the first vehicle. Believe me, for all the media in this room, you'd glue on to an Obama national security strategy right now. I think that would draw your attention, draw some conclusions, and I think the world would see it as a statement.
In the very back. Oh, briefly, we're online, so.
Sorry, is it fair, therefore, to say that for the first 8 months of the Obama administration, we've essentially seen strategic drift on those bigger issues?
No, I don't know what's going on. They could be beavering away, on the national security strategy right now. My encouragement would be we don't have a lot of time, and maybe these are not easy things to write and to capture. They have to be all inclusive. We have to understand what we're telling not only our friends and enemies out there with that statement, but internally the direction we intend for that to provide. It has to be a thoughtful document. I don't know what's going on in the administration. I have no knowledge. My one attempt to be part of it was, was interesting.
We're going to get to that. Dan, if you need to step outside and call Tom Donilon and say where that report is, to get a headline tomorrow, I won't mind. Yes, right here.
Tamam Al-Barazi from Al-Watan Al-Arabi magazine. Since you were an envoy to Palestine and Israel, what elements you can envisage in Obama coming initiative toward, creating a Palestinian state in there?
Great, thank you.
Actually, we talked at some length about this before I came here because Steve had asked me what my recommendation would be on the process. I'll tell you what I learned in my time, and I learned that envoys are useless. And I was
another headline,
and I was one. An envoy, if it's a very narrow, specific mission, I think an envoy is useful. I don't understand all these envoys we have now. They're not confirmed by Congress. They assume authority beyond, and if the envoy's ego is big enough, he'll eat the structure that's legitimately there. But I don't understand how an envoy, which is temporary and ad hoc and by its own definition, is going to resolve something that I think is going to take a lot of detail, a lot of time, a lot of committed effort. I found the envoy too distracting. The focus gets on the envoy and not the process. I can tell you that from personal. I would come home to cut the grass, and they would say the process is going into the toilet. It's failing. Zinni's leaving. It didn't mean anything. But the envoy becomes the center of attention. So I think you need a permanent address there, and you need a large contingent because the issues there were by my counting 10 final status issues, and many other less significant but important issues beyond that. And how you could resolve those on a quick trip, on a temporary basis, is beyond me. It's never worked, yet we continue to repeat a process that doesn't work. Summits don't work. Bringing everybody together in Annapolis or Taba or wherever, everybody signs the paper. You can paper the wall with all the agreements in principle. They don't work. And so trying to put the elephant on a table and everybody eating it at one bite doesn't work. And so I've come to the conclusion that, you need to have a large political, economic, security, and monitoring component on the ground. And they need to start from the bottom up instead of the top down. Don't give me agreements in principle. As a matter of fact, Colin Powell told me when he sent me over there, I don't need another plan. He said, I got plenty of them. He said, take one plan, the tenant plan, try to put it into, everybody had signed and agreed to it, try to put it into play. And so what we were doing was building work plans, not agreements in principle, but physically how with the security, implementation plans. And to me, the answer is start from the bottom up. Work out economic agreements, work out border and other issues, work out security agreements, work on the right of return issues, water, all these issues with working groups. You can have some sort of political structure over the top. The next thing I would do is open up 3 lines of communication. A formal sort of negotiating line, a private back channel line, and an unofficial track 2 line, where the parties get to pick who goes in there, but it's unofficial. So you have retired academics, you have retired military diplomats. That's where you float ideas that politically can't be floated in that process. That's where the out-of-the-box ideas come up and the thoughts and the sticky points without an official sort of association can be done. But I think my point is, and there's a lot more detail than this, I'd go in here today, but what I think is a much more detailed, much more significant, robust structure on the ground. I would increase the quartet to a quintet. There needs to be Arab representation in there, maybe the Arab League. You can't be on the sidelines. You got to be part of the process if you have vested interests, which they claim to have and do have in my mind. So I think a major restructuring, a major commitment, accept the time it's going to take, work all the issues from the bottom up, and maybe even implement them as you come to agreement with them rather than waiting for the ultimate solution.
Can you just touch on the security note of that you believe a security deal is achievable?
I think security is the easiest because in my time, I primarily focused on the security forces from both sides. They know what it's going to take to make it happen. They know exactly how to. I mean, right now there's a process that's not getting much attention. 4 cities have been turned over to Palestinian security control. A number of checkpoints have been removed. So far, knock on wood, it's going well. When you let the security guys work out the security issues on the ground with basic objectives, they'll figure it out. Believe me. They know each other well. When I used to bring them in the room, they'd hug and kiss each other. They knew each other for years. They've been in each other's prisons. They speak each other's languages, And it's when I could get the political guys out of the room, you could actually get something done. And so, I think the same if you bring people together, work out some sort of economic cooperation, elements to this too. And so I think a bottom up is the best way to go. I was also telling Steve, don't get into debates about principle. You can't win them. I mean, I'm not going to argue birthright, right of return. You can't win those. What you got to say is, look, no one's going to argue you're right. What we're asking you is settle out of court. Waive the right. Let's figure out a way to implement it. Physically. The other thing is don't argue who's responsible for the problem because you're not going to win. You're not going to change anybody's mind. Think of your kids. This is what I used to tell them. Think of your kids and your grandkids. How are they going to live in peace? The final thing I'll say about this, the United States got to get out of business of putting peace plans on the table. The parties themselves have to develop the plan, not the United States. When I've done 8 peace mediations around the world, and when the facilitator or mediator puts the plan on the table, it's doomed. They got to have a vested interest and a sense of ownership of that plan. It's the one they got to live with, not the one we're going to impose on either side or both of them.
Interesting. Yes, right here.
Thank you. Mohammed Qasim. I'm retired now. I think something's been very wrong about Afghanistan. No Afghan had hurt an American. It was 800 Wahhabis who did the dirty deal. Yet you went in and smashed the country. Afghans destroyed the Red Army. It wasn't NATO. It wasn't Ronald Reagan. It was that sleazy congressman from Texas. They got nothing. They got smashed. And 8 years they've been there. Today, 70 years minus 20 hours of Wehrmacht marched into Poland, and the Red Army came in thereafter. It's 8 years now. What went wrong?
Thank you.
How come there's no accountability amongst your officers who are stupid white men in uniform?
Thank you.
Well, I would say, first of all, one of the many reasons I opposed Iraq is we would become distracted in Afghanistan. And we wasted 8 years, much of 8 years, in that we weren't paying attention to it. I actually met President Karzai in New York when the decision to go in Iraq was announced. He was there for a UN meeting. And I never saw anybody so discouraged. It says, you know, what has just happened now is the interest in Afghanistan, the donors, the international attention, the commitment is gone. I mean, he predicted it. So I think 8 years were wasted because of the distraction with Iraq. And if you remember after 9/11, you know, Lamund was saying, we're all Americans today, the support, we lost a lot of support and internationalization, as I mentioned, of the effort that could have happened. Let me say something about the graveyard of empires, all right? Because if I hear it one more time, I think I'm going to throw up. Everybody that's gone into Afghanistan wanted to stay. The difference is we don't want to stay. You know, we don't want to stay. We're not Alexander or the Russians or anybody else. You know, or the Brits or anybody else. We don't intend to stay. We want to work ourselves out of a job. That's one difference about what happened in the past. We want to leave something behind that is stability, that recognizes basic human rights, that does not become a sanctuary for problems around the rest of the world. Our intentions are not conquest and exploitation in there, and that is a big difference. And so, you know, before we sort of list ourselves with other historically non-analogous adventures in there, remember that's the premise of what we're trying to do. I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying this to who we're at, what we've got to convey out there too, and that's got to be part of everything we do. Work ourselves out of this job. You know, in Iraq, where we honestly believed as soon as we pull out of the cities, the whole place is going to collapse. Well, there have been problems, but it hasn't collapsed. And as long as we support the security forces and we work hard to ensure that the government is responsive to the needs of the people, when I walk the streets of Mosul and Baghdad and Basra and talk to the people, and I said, what's it going to take for you to support the government? They basically said to me, put my electricity on 24/7, pick up the garbage, make the sewer system work. You know, if that government's responsive to my needs, then we're going to be okay. You know, and that was the majority of the people. Doesn't mean there aren't elements that will blow something up once in a while, and there still isn't a ways for their security forces to go. But it is clearly time for American combat forces to leave, past time. And it's time to take the training wheels off for the Iraqi government and security forces. There'll be a time in Afghanistan for that, too. I don't think that's with the Russian intent or Alexander's intent or British intent back in the days of empire. And so I say to you, that's one significant difference in my mind.
Arno Dvorskraf.
Thank you, Arno Dvorskraf, CSIS General. During the campaign, President Obama, and since the campaign, since he entered the White House, has suggested that he favored the Afghan war because that's where Al-Qaeda is. And I think you would agree that Al-Qaeda has left Afghanistan. So what is the point of trying to pursue that particular objective and making the country believe that that's what he favors?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure where Al-Qaeda is. I'm glad you know, Armin, but if they're not they're in Pakistan, we know that. And everybody asks me, where's Osama bin Laden? I don't know. He's on K Street. He's a lobbyist. I don't know where the hell he is, you know? And I don't think that they've suddenly settled into Afghanistan and taken out a lease. You know? Yeah, I mean, they'll be back in Afghanistan as soon as we leave if the environment's right. The point is not where they are now, it's where they'll find sanctuary. And if they can't find sanctuary in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they'll find it in Somalia. And we'll have to chase them and keep the pressure on them, because when you take the pressure off, they'll be up to no good. And like I said before, you'll see another embassy blow up, another military installation, or maybe worse. Maybe the reach extends beyond that. Secondly, I will tell you that are we willing to accept destabilization of that part of the world, that region? Is that okay? Is pulling out make it not worth it, and we can live with that? And thirdly, we've seen the Taliban in action. It took their own atrocities for the Pakistanis to wake up and the people to say enough is enough. And to send their military. General Kiani did not want to do this unless the Pakistani people were fully behind him. And the Taliban handed it to him on a platter by what they did in Bunir and Swat. And so now the popular support, media support, and he's able to hold the government, you know, to say don't pull the rug out from under me, and the troops are in there with the support of the people. Could it happen in Afghanistan? I don't know. Is it worth trying to build the Afghan security forces and the government to some level? That's a decision the American people are going to have to make. All I would say is, before we just say this costs too much, we have no business there, and we decide to try to pinpoint, Al-Qaeda and make these decisions, remember, ask ourselves, what happens if we pull out? Is that acceptable? Because that's really the answer now. It's not really whether we should or shouldn't be doing this. Is what will result when we pull out acceptable to us and the rest of the world? And if the answer to that is yes, we can live with it, fine. I would tell you, from my humble judgment, you're going to rue the day you let go of it.
Do you trust Kiani and the Pakistani military?
I trust Kiani and the Pakistani military from many perspectives. One, I fought by their side in Somalia. They are good troops. They'll fight. And I can't say that about all NATO nations, but they will fight. They're committed. They have suffered more casualties in this conflict than we have suffered or others have suffered. Few have recognized that publicly, when they made the commitment. I think Kiani sees this as an existential threat. I think Kiani understands something very well, and that is you need the popular support of the Pakistani people and a commitment by the government if you're going to get engaged in this. And that's what he demanded as sets of conditions going in my mind, and he got it. And again, courtesy of the Taliban, they delivered it to him, and now he has that backing. And they're determined. They have, given the resources they have, which were not the right kind of resources. They are not a counterinsurgency force. They're learning on the job, which has been very difficult. They're fighting through some very difficult problems. They tried to establish a large command to deal with the humanitarian problems, which has been very difficult. He now faces the extreme cost and expense of garrisoning troops up there for a while because they don't have the kind of police that can take over under that threat. That will have to be built. So there's a large set of economic conditions, resettling displaced persons, now garrisoning troops up there, rebuilding a police force is a tremendous resource problem that they're going to have going forward for this. But he went into those hills making that commitment. And so far, so good.
Right here. We'll move on.
General,
you got to do the microphone.
Understood. My question is about Afghanistan. Your most bold recommendation that you made for the new administration about how to rework it, stand a new command within the Defense Department to work on civil affairs. I want to repeat back this anecdote, and maybe you could put some more flesh on those bones. Young commanders in Afghanistan, lieutenants on the ground, they have been quite dynamic in responding to threats. They're fighting war differently than it's been done before. From one valley to the next, they're operating with different leadership and different mechanisms. One of the things that I've heard from my friends who are those lieutenants on the ground is that all those civil affairs, what you want to call soft power or the smart power on its best day, they are completely the opposite. They're completely focused on the top-down, centralized management, bureaucracy from the center, which has never worked in Afghanistan. I just went to a forum this morning, had more verification from the people who were there to observe the elections recently, that this kind of top-down, center planning just doesn't work.
Right.
There's two different bits of the information there. One, the military at its best does have that dynamism, that ability to move locally and make changes. Is that what you're getting to, that our institutions, USAID, State Department, are still stuck in a 1960s mindset where it's like some central authority is going to send out plans, et cetera?
Thank you.
I think it's got to be both. I think you obviously, what we don't understand is, if you drive 500 miles, 1,000 miles in the United States, basically everything's the same. The accent might be a little different, but basically it's the same. What I think we don't understand is if you go 10 miles in some places of the world, it drastically changes. The ethnic makeup, the outlook on the world, everything changes drastically. So there has to be a localized element. And you're right. If you're in Anbar province, you see something differently than maybe your British counterpart in Basra, than your American counterpart in Kurdistan or wherever. And so there has to be a centralized program, but it needs to be decentralized in its application and implementation. When my son came back from Haditha with the Marines there, I picked him up. He's a captain, and I said to him, "What's this war is all about from your point of view, from the Captain Zinni's point of view?" He said, "It's about tribes, guns, money, power, and jobs." He said, "Where I was, if you understand those 5 things, how to influence them, who controls them, what it's all about, and you can play in those 5 areas, then you'll understand this war and you can contribute to stability." Now, none of those 5 things were in his manual that he learned in the conventional application of fire as a maneuver or whatever. You know, he learned that on the ground, as his brother lieutenants and captains did. And every one of those things are very localized. So you could have a general in Baghdad program that deals with job creation. But then on its implementation in the ground, you need to tailor it to whether it's an agrarian or an industrial or if it's, you know, tribally controlled, or if there's some sort of more government-oriented structure. So it has to have that flexibility in administration. And so what I'm saying is, when you get to doing this with a civil affairs command, there will be the centralized planning, resource allocation, but it'll be a pull system. You know, it'll be a system that matches the need on the ground, because the variety can be so great from province to province, region to region, or even town to town.
Brian Katulis here. We'll try and go on asking Brian right here.
General, thanks for your comments. I want to ask you about Iran's nuclear program. I suspect this month will be a pivotal month in the debate over that. Do you see there's a couple of deadlines that have been issued by the Obama administration, if they are deadlines, to get Iran to respond? And who knows? Where are you? I mean, I've seen your public statements. Is there anything the U.S. can do, or others, to change the strategic calculations of Iran? Should we prepare for the inevitability of an Iranian bomb? And if yes, what does that mean for the security architecture of the Gulf region?
Well, first of all, I think what's confusing to me, and has been for almost the whole time I've been focused on Iran, is when they're going to get the capability. I think back in early 90s, late 80s, somebody told me they're 3 years away. And ever since they've told me they're 3 years away. So as long as we can keep it 3 years away, we're okay. But I think, you know, seriously, we haven't defined the red line. And I would tell you, Israelis I know have defined it much differently than we've defined it, and of course see it as an existential threat. Is it how much enriched uranium? Is it the ability to weaponize it? Is it the actual weaponization? So the first problem is, where's the red line, you know, in terms of this? And by red line, I mean that when it becomes, in the words of Senator McCain, unacceptable, and what that means. Now, let me talk from a military perspective. If there's a decision to take military action, I'm going to ask you the "and then what" question. So somebody tells me to strike, okay, and then what? After you've dropped those bombs on those hardened facilities, what happens next? What happens if they decide in their hardened shelters with their mobile missiles to start launching those? What happens if they launch them into U.S. troop bases on the other side of the Gulf? What happens if they launch them to Israel or somewhere else, into a Saudi oil field, into Ras Laffan, where all the natural gas, you know? What happens if they now flush their fast patrol boats with cruise missiles, the Dow's full of mines, and they sink a tanker, an oil tanker? And, of course, the economy of the world goes absolutely nuts. What happens if they activate sleeper cells, the MOIS, the intelligence service? And now what happens if another preemptive attack by the West, U.S. and Israel, and they fire up the streets, and now we got problems? Just tell me how to deal with all that, okay? Because eventually, if you follow this all the way down, eventually I'm putting boots on the ground somewhere. And like I tell my friends, if you like Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll love Iran, you know, if you want to go in there. Now, you know, so that, you know, the thing I always get back, well, what would you want us to do? It's not my decision. It's your decision. You want the military equation to this? There isn't. I can give you an Iran war plan. You're going to get sticker shock, you know, when you see it. And so you have to be prepared to all that. You can't assume away reactions. You know, I've heard others say, you just strike them, they'll take it, they'll eat it. Now, how do you change Iran? In my mind, it can only be done from within, not from without. I don't think external pressure is going to have as much effect. I will be honest with you, I would have liked to seen us more supportive of those people in the streets. You know, they were looking, I think, to the United States, especially the youth, to recognize what they were doing. They wanted to hear the words. I think in many cases exiles have a lot more influence than those clowns we dealt with in Iraq. You know, and here where exiles have credibility, do communicate. You know, I think we should have worked to internationalize support, you know, for those people in the street. You know, even if it was just to tell you we're with you, we believe in you, you know, we understand your sacrifice and what you're trying to do. We began to see a split in the regime. You saw Rafsanjani and Khatami. and on the other side, Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, and none of that got anywhere. And we were kind of mute, which disappointed me a great deal. If it's going to come, it's going to come from within. And I don't think we've leveraged that enough or supported it or understood it enough. It's a naturally secular Persian society, very young, and they want change. That's the opportunity in my mind.
We'll go here. Brian is very connected, so you need to say deadlines are bad. Yes.
Michael Lame, Rethink the Middle East. My own thinking about America's place in the world has been altered by our current economic condition. And as deficits and the national debt mushroom, I think more about what Steve was saying about limits. And perhaps we ought to go a different direction. Instead of towards nation building, go back to the military's original core competencies, which are blowing things up and killing people. And instead of boots on the ground, more drones in the air. So what about the possibility of we draw back from nation building and say we're going to stop the people who are trying to kill us and let the locals rebuild their own countries, and leave the rebuilding or the building, a nation building, to what needs to be rebuilt in America.
So no doubt you had some influence on George Will.
When the Bush administration first came in, before 9/11, I had just retired. And I was asked to join a study group that was sponsored by the Pentagon and Office of Secretary of Defense, and they were looking at the new transformational military. And the first part of that they had laid on the table was cutting the Army to 4 to 5 divisions from 10 and reducing the ground forces. And I remember in these discussions, I was sitting across from a retired Air Force 4-star, and I was trying to explain how many of the things we're going to face now are manpower intensive, boots on the ground. That, whatever you're dropping from 30,000 feet, we've tried shock and all, turned into all shucks, and believing that firepower and precision weapons and all this does it all, doesn't understand the problem you face on the ground. And he looked over at me and he said, "You're yesterday's news. The need for large ground forces is gone. All we need are small 500-man gendarmerie units to just sort of police the battlefield after we've done what we do with our space-based intelligence systems, our precision weapons." That was 8 years ago, and we're increasing the size of the Army and the Marine Corps now. So I would say if you honestly believe that technologies, the McNamara solution, technology is a solution to all this, we don't need to build capacity on the ground to deal with this. We just bomb potential enemies if we can find them, if we know where they are. And the answer to all this is just destroying things and killing people. And that's what we are as a nation, and that's how we extend our influence, and that's what makes us Jefferson's shining beacon on the hill. I must be on the wrong country, because I don't agree with that at all. We have taken risks for values before. I have, my son has, and why don't we just nuke them then? Why do we even bother with precision weapons and drones? The easiest solution is we can make a parking lot out of Fatah or the Swat Valley or wherever we think they might be. I mean, what's the ultimate decision then in the end of that? Is that who we are? Is that what we want to say? And I don't say it's nation building, it's institution building. We're not trying to reshape, we shouldn't be trying to, and sometimes we do reshape nations. We're trying to build the right kinds of security, political, economic, and social institutions that allow a society to resist the destabilizing forces it faces. And it should be blended within their own cultural and heritage acceptability in the way we do it. This idea of Jeffersonian democracy and free market economy that we're trying to, fairy dust around the world is ridiculous. And I think there has to be a more sensible approach that might be doable and sustainable in that case. But I would not resort to what you suggest, because I just think it says something wrong about who we are.
The American Strategy Program totally agrees. Yes.
Gentlemen, my name is Ahmad Raza Kasuri. I'm one of the founding fathers of Pakistan Constitution of 1973, and back home I'm a senior attorney at law, Supreme Court of Pakistan. My observation is that Pakistan Army, which is a highly trained professional army, has flushed the Taliban from the Swat Valley. The IDP have gone back. We have earmarked 50 billion rupees in our text, in our budget, but not against the text budgetary support, but against the promises made at Tokyo by the Friends of Pakistan Club. So far, when I left Pakistan, the government statement was that only about 12% money has moved into the kitty of Pakistan. Now, if that money does not come, there are two possibilities. If we take this money towards the Swat for rehabilitation, our budget will collapse because 50 billion rupees is a huge, big sum for a small budget like Pakistan. And if we don't, then the rehabilitation program in Swat will collapse. And if that happens, the Taliban are on the periphery of Swat Valley. This frustrated people who will feel that they have been betrayed, that will become a very fertile ground for the Taliban to move in and to operate. And that will be a very, very difficult situation. So my respectful submission is that donors' countries should come forward, that this is not our battle alone. It's a battle of the international world, because the whole world is saying that Pakistan is a safe haven for the Taliban. If that being so, then we are the first and the last bulwark of security against the Taliban in that region. If we fall, then this tirade will stop somewhere in Washington, Bonds, London, and Paris. So this has to be dealt collectively. It's not our war. It's a war of for the people who believe in peace against this.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well,
quick comments?
Quick comment. I think you heard me say that the biggest issue in Pakistan, now that the commitment is made, is going to be the resources to sustain that and to rebuild police and infrastructure in those areas, garrison the military for the time that's needed. So I agree with the demand and the requirement. I also agree that it's not just Pakistan's war. I think it's Pakistan's war also, but it's everybody's war, and that kind of commitment needs to be made. I recognize the tough economic conditions that we're in, and that may be limited. And I think we ought to look at smarter ways of doing this. I mean, in terms of providing the right kinds of equipment to the military and other things that can be done, rather than doing this more expensively. I think to go to the last point I would make, to go to your point about the quality of the Pakistani military and their willingness to fight, we have somebody that's fighting. It's not requiring U.S. boots on the ground or coalition boots. Pakistanis now are willing to take this on their own, and so we should support that. That's what we like to see, and so we should make sure that this succeeds in that respect.
So, I know there are many questions, Matt. I appreciate it. We're getting near the end. I've got two quick questions up here that are going to be very fast. We're going to take. I'm going to encourage people who want to ask their questions to buy the book and to come up. In general, I'm going to get the first one signed here to me. But let me take your question together.
Thank you very much. Jamie Morgan with BAE Systems.
This is a conflict of interest? No. Okay, he's suspended. He's not CEO today at this moment.
I'd never take that.
To follow up with the question about the proposed Civil Affairs Command, I've been told to be brief. So quickly, what do you think about the potential issue of loss of existent expertise in other institutions, such as state and aid, and having it fall under DOD? We've seen with AFRICOM, currently 4 State Department officials are there. And then with that, would you see that command is responsible for addressing both looking at post-conflict situation, but also the pre-conflict situation in smart power?
And then this lady, we're going to go to this lady right here, and then take your question as well.
Thank you, General Zaini. Farah Hatasi, President of the Arab Information and Resource Center. I want to go quickly back to Al-Qaeda issue, and I agree with you of all the reasons you stated why we should focus on Afghanistan and allocate the resources. But let's assume that we captured bin Laden. Will we declare the end of the war on terror? Do you think Al-Qaeda exists in Afghanistan and Pakistan? They are in Indonesia, they are in Yemen, they are in Somalia, they are in Britain, maybe they are here. Right. I think we should allocate more resources to understand the roots of this problem, to understand the ideology. I think in any national security plans that you will propose or will be studied should be encouraged a lot of resources on people-to-people communication rather than government-to-government or government-to-people communication. Okay. Right. People-to-people communication and understanding the environment.
Thank you very much. Two great questions.
Well, on the first question, I think I'm proposing the Civil Affairs Command as a framework that State Department, AID, other agencies can plug into. But it would have a planning process. It would have structure. It can form teams. It has organizational capability the military brings. It can deploy you, make sure you got security. It has the ability to team in the right ways and to make sure that it can meet the needs. And it has certain inherent military capabilities. We have foreign area officers. We have advisors. We're trying to legitimize that more and more and provide for that so we can augment that. So I see as civil affairs that does not exclude those other agencies. It welcomes them in a more structured environment. You know, look what happened when we had to piece together the CPA and the PRTs and get people on the ground. You know, people didn't have the right expertise, didn't know where to go, who wanted to come, what it meant in terms of their career status and everything else. We saw that, and I don't think that's going to change, unfortunately. So that's why I make the suggestion. As far as the second question goes, you know, I do agree. But remember, Indonesia, where there's Jamal Ismailia and there are others, they're coping with the problem. We're in places where they can't cope with a problem. And I think where they can cope with the problem, like Indonesia and elsewhere, you help and you support, and the people-to-people dialogue is the lead. Where there is no security system and the atrocities are committed, unfortunately, then the military has to lead. Does not mean the people-to-people don't go on. It means your military focus is greater. In places where the security situation is adequate but shaky, security assistance is the answer, helping build local capabilities. The last thing you want U.S. troops trying to deal with this, you want locals to deal with this much better. I do think, and I agree with you 100%, that the other elements and the dialogue have not been sufficient. We do a lousy job on communication. I do think the answer is education. You look at the number of young people that want to come to the United States, the UK, to school. We give them misery through the visa process. They can get the scholarships, hard to get them here. And to me, that is a big part of the answer. You know, the youth is just going to be generational how this changes. It's a battle for the youth and on both sides, and the influence has to come through education and building the kind of cross-cultural relationships that are necessary. And that has to be a key part. And the lead part in other places, but the wolf on the sled you have to shoot in places like Afghanistan is the security issue first, in my mind.
Before we thank you and we rush you out to deal with those folks who would like to get your book, if Secretary of State Clinton called and said, "I've got another ambassadorship for you, and this time it's real," thoughts?
Yeah, the last time I got asked this question, I used the analogy of Charlie Brown when he went to kick the football and Lucy pulled it away. I think Lucy might do it again. I'm worried about that, so I don't know. You know.
General Zinni, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great. Well, let me take you out front real quick.